Napoleon has been complaining for several months of a sharp pain on his right side. It's thought that he has liver issues.
He is sweating a lot. He has a fever.
These are very intense, sudden pains. He sometimes compares them to stabs or snake attacks.
And this pain intensifies. He complains about it, which prevents him from moving. As soon as they try to get him out of his bed, this pain is totally unbearable.
He has a few minutes of consciousness per day. He seems older than he actually is.
He seems relatively calm, almost resigned to death.
The Emperor's bed was moved to the Longwood drawing room, which is the largest room and especially has the advantage of having 2 windows, so it can be aired out more easily. And above all, the comings and goings of the servants, doctors, and staff are facilitated.
It's a rather small living room with English carpet, English-style furniture provided by the cabinet maker Bloch. There is blue floral wallpaper on the wall. There is a quite pretty chandelier. So it's a rather fancy place, perhaps somewhat bourgeois.
When we think that Napoleon used to stay at the Escorial, at the Kremlin, at the Tuileries, this end in this small room on a camp bed obviously gives a tragic dimension to Napoleon's death.
He is bedridden in the camp beds. These campaign beds, in fact, that he brought back to Longwood because he prefers them to the traditional beds you might have in a house.
Napoleon surrounded himself with all the memories of his past life. For example, the sword of Austerlitz placed on his chair. The Marengo coat that the emperor wore at the Battle of Marengo on June 14th, 1800.
He brought many portraits and engravings of his wife Marie-Louise and his son the King of Rome and placed them close to his bed so he could see them as much as possible.
But there is also the figure of Josephine, his first wife, whom he never really forgot.
Napoleon behaves like a monarch. He wants to die as a monarch, as an emperor.
Being settled in the living room means being in the public room of Longwood. He's also settled on his camp bed that he had never left. So it is like he's the god of war.
It's a theater scene. It's the last scene of the play, and it has to be perfect, to the very end.
This desire to control his image and how he will be perceived externally is apparent. And notably, we see it quite clearly in the way Napoleon himself dictates a blank communique announcing his death to Governor Hudson Lowe.
It is Emperor Napoleon who is speaking, so he wants to emphasize that it is the sovereign who is dying on St. Helena and not General Bonaparte, the title given to him by the English.
Governor, Emperor Napoleon is dead on the blank space, following a long and painful illness. I have the honor to inform you. He authorized me to communicate, if you wish to hear them, his last wishes. It's crisp, flawless, clean, typical Napoleon.
Isolated in the middle of the ocean, between Brazil and the coasts of Africa, Longwood House in St. Helena is the most well-guarded prison in the world. To ensure the monitoring of the illustrious captive, 2 frigates patrol permanently around the island, and 3,000 soldiers stand guard outside under the orders of the chief jailer, Major General Sir Hudson Lowe.
For months and years, England had been waiting for the fatal outcome that would somehow definitively free Europe from the one the British consider an ogre.
Around the deathbed are the last people living with him in exile. The dignitaries of the imperial court, General Bertrand and his wife Fanny, General de Montholon, but also Napoleon's loyal servants, the valet marchand, or even Mameluke Ali.
His was called Mameluke Ali, although his name was actually Louis-Étienne Saint-Denis. He was from Versailles, but wore a Mameluke uniform under the Empire.
Marchand is Napoleon's first valet, so he is the one who knows the most about his intimacy. And during the agony, he watched over the emperor.
Marchand is extremely refined, very considerate, very sensitive to emotion as well, and as such, he is capable of stepping back.
Napoleon calls him my son, my little one. They have quite a tender relationship.
The emperor stays on his bed, lying on his back. Sometimes he is placed on his side because it seems to relieve him. He makes some complaints. He breathes very, very poorly.
His flannel is changed regularly to keep him warm. His feet and legs are wrapped with warm towels, and most importantly, there is always someone present. 24 hours a day, someone is by his side to attend to his needs.
Napoleon also suffers from hiccups that exhaust him. They try to get rid of this hiccup, but for example, if they want to give him something to drink, Napoleon cannot keep anything down. So, the hiccup, in fact, cannot be overcome.
Here we have a man who is a soldier above all else and who is fighting his final battle. And let's not forget the terrible words he uttered on the night before his death. It was in the middle of the night, and suddenly there was this heart-wrenching cry, "Oh, here comes death."
His last words to Bertrand were, "What is there after?" He takes a break and says nothing.
We will never know if, deep down, Napoleon believed or did not believe. As a sovereign, he went to Mass every day. At Longwood, he heard Mass quite often, and in the last days of his life, he spent several hours with Abbe Vignali, likely to put his affairs in order with God, and it is very likely that he received the last rites at that time.
In his last days, Napoleon is no longer very lucid, but there are memories that remain very present in his mind. On one hand, there are memories from early childhood. He remembers Corsica, he talks a lot about Ajaccio, and on the other hand, he thinks a lot about his son. He thinks of him during moments of lucidity where he asks to be brought a portrait of his son so he can gaze at it one last time. And on the other hand, he also thinks of him in his moments of delirium.
As he lies on his deathbed, Napoleon complains to General Bertrand about not being able to take a fortress. Bertrand furrows his brow, and Napoleon says, "Actually, this fortress is your wife, General. She has been faithful to you, and I wouldn't have had the possibility to seduce her." As a gentleman, Bertrand won't add a word.
Napoleon's chief doctor is Dr. Antoine Marquis, who is a Frenchman originally from Corsica and is, in a way, the emperor's doctor. So, in principle, only he has the right to treat him.
So Antoine Marquis is an excellent at dissection, but that doesn't make him a great doctor. Napoleon is surrounded by medical care, knowing that this extremely pragmatic man truly has no trust in medicine. Antoine Marquis, despite everything, makes attempts. He takes care of his patient.
He is chilled, so Dr. Antoine Marquis is going to try to place a hot water bottle on his stomach to warm him and apply a poultice on the soles of his feet.
After having tried other things, including an emetic to make him vomit, Napoleon is given a potion he himself had forbidden. A solution with calomel, that is to say powder mixed mainly with mercury. It is also called mild mercury. 10 grains of calomel are equivalent to about a little more than 5 grams.
And the loyal valet Marchand secretly administers it to him, which earns him those terrible words pronounced by the emperor. You too, you betray me too.
They administer a large dose of mercury, which has the effect of causing internal hemorrhages, and in fact, Napoleon bleeds out. At the time, one must survive both the illness and the doctors, and well, Napoleon survived neither.
And gradually, he falls into a sort of apathy, punctuated by frequent vomiting. His body expels black substances that, according to a witness, resemble coffee grounds, and he gradually enters into agony.
The pulse was very weak or intermittent. Several times during the day, people thought he had died.
Almost his last words would be army or head of the army. Then he asks Marchant, "What is my son's name? Obviously, Marchant replies, Napoleon.
Some are, in a way, hanging on to Napoleon's sigh, which is regularly checked. Then, in the final moment, a first sigh, a second sigh, a third, and everyone holds their breath, waiting for the next one. And it's the moment when they realize that Napoleon was mortal.
Madame Bertrand probably gets up and, as it was done at the time when people died, stops the clock. It is 5:49. Napoleon is dead.
At that time, people let their tears flow quite easily, probably more than today, and tears are pouring abundantly in the Longwood room at that moment.
The face of the emperor in the hours following the death seems increasingly peaceful, increasingly serene, and he is found to be beautiful. And it is the beauty of this dead man, the Emperor of the French, dead on his bed of agony, that truly, I would say, strikes the people around him.
The contrast, the image of a man so powerful, emperor, master of the world, who ends his life on the rock of St. Helena, can only strike the imagination.
It is truly death stripped bare, and it is precisely because this death is stripped bare, because he does not utter final words, that this death will later take on a legendary dimension. When he arrives in Rochefort, there are indeed the 2 frigates, but there are no safe conduct.
Very quickly, he realizes that he could not leave Rochefort without fighting an English flotilla.
And he understands that he has fallen into a trap, that he is therefore a prisoner in Rochefort, surrounded by the English at the port.
First boarded on the frigate La Salle, Napoleon, tired of waiting for the departure signal, requests to be taken to the small island of Aix, 5 kilometers from the French coast. Warmly welcomed by the local population with his entourage, he settles in the most beautiful house on the island, which is the governor's.
We enter the room that Napoleon occupied in July 1815 on the island of Aix. He doesn't leave this room, so he locks himself in and doesn't show himself. He receives many visitors, and it is clear that he is contemplating the decision he must make. He has 2 options. Either he obtains the safe conduct and departs for exile in the United States, or he does not obtain them, and the English surveillance is reinforced, which means that the frigates transporting him engage in combat against the British ships.
To reach America, Napoleon would have had to be cunning. He was offered to hide in the ship's hold.
He does not want to leave like a fugitive, and he greatly fears ridicule. He fears being intercepted, and in a way, ending his legend by being caught like a fugitive. So, he imagines another solution.
Napoleon is a gambler. Like all gamblers, as long as he has cards in hand, well, he is ready to continue the game. And for him, it is there, in the fact that the English never surrendered to him, but he himself never surrendered to the English. And he thinks that deep down, the chivalrous spirit of the English will benefit him, that the English will grant him asylum.
In short, he finally chooses to surrender to the English.
On July 13th, 1815, Napoleon finally decides to write to the Prince Regent of England. Royal Highness, faced with the factions dividing my country and the hostility of the greatest powers of Europe, I have ended my political career, and I come like Themistocles to be welcomed by the British hearth. I place myself under the protection of those laws that I seek from your Royal Highness as the most powerful, most steadfast, and most generous of my enemies. By referring to Themistocles in this letter to the Prince Regent, it is the reference to the defeated who surrenders to his conqueror. but who receives from his conqueror a hospitality which will, moreover, allow him to settle at the court of his adversary.
He appealed to the generosity of the Prince Regent, which was probably a non-existent quality in the Prince Regent in that respect. Long term, maybe, he might have hoped that he might get some sort of fair play from the British, but he must have known that for the majority of British public opinion, he was an ogre. He was the hateful tyrant that the British had finally beaten.
Without waiting for the response from the Prince Regent, Napoleon goes aboard the nearest English ship, the Bellerophon. He is promptly taken to Plymouth's roads, where he waits for permission to disembark.
It was a huge matter of fascination for the British when Napoleon surrendered to the Royal Navy. People came from Scotland to try to catch a glimpse of him. There was a massive interest in him, and people went out on small boats to Plymouth to try to catch a sight of him, and people cheered him. Such was his sort of superstar status. He felt at that time that there was a chance that he was going to be able to be welcomed to the British hearth, as he put it.
But then, the British officials come to see him in the finest cabin provided for the ex-emperor of the French, and they tell him, "You will not go in England, it was never the plan. You will go to the island of St. Helena." Napoleon bursts out and says, "You have betrayed me."
It's possible to feel sorry for him on this account, but one has to remember that the 100 days since he left Elba had cost 100,000 killed and wounded on all sides, and the British government, frankly, were never going to send him anywhere that he could ever escape from again.
Little by little, he resigns himself. He seems to accept this decision, at least on the surface. In fact, he has a conversation with Las Casas where he essentially tells him, "Well, I could end it all here. I just have to throw myself into the water and it would all be over." But he adds this magnificent phrase. He says, "But it is very difficult to put an end to hope and glory."
On October 14th, the Northumberland arrives in sight of St. Helena, and the reactions of Napoleon's entourage are appalled because it is an island that, from afar, appears quite sinister, with extremely high cliffs. One of the ladies in the Emperor's entourage allegedly exclaimed, "It is the devil who shat this island," while flying from one world to another.
They understand that it is both a prison and perhaps a tomb, because it looks like one.
This pile of rocks in the middle of the South Atlantic is 3,000 kilometers from the Brazilian coast.
Napoleon already knew the island of St. Helena. He'd even noted in one of his youth notebooks while learning geography, St. Helena, small island. So, for me, it's an irony of fate. If he ever knew at that moment that he would end his life on the island of St. Helena.
While waiting for the English to finish preparing his residence, Napoleon rents a pavilion from the Briards, a country house near the only town, Jamestown.
At first, he is charmed by the place, by the Briards sheltered from the winds, quite flowery. He likes these green settings. Napoleon always loved bucolic places, so he likes this setting.
While staying at Briard, Napoleon spends a lot of time with the Balcombe family. In the Balcombe family, there is the father, the mother, and the two daughters. And among the two daughters, there is little Betsy, with whom Napoleon will play a lot and frolic.
He plays blind man's bluff with her. She threatens him with a sword for fun.
He lets himself be called Bonnie, the nickname given by the English. And truly, he has almost a paternal role towards this little girl. In any case, he takes a lot of pleasure in it.
You have to imagine this deposed emperor with this English girl who is barely 15 years old, and Napoleon even seems to prefer her company to that of his companions in exile, which leads to the first jealousies.
Two months after his arrival, Napoleon moves to Longwood House. On 1,000 square meters divided into about 20 rooms, this one-story T-shaped building was chosen by the English to house him, along with about 50 people from his entourage.
Napoleon has, in a private and truly confidential manner, essentially 3 small rooms, barely less than 10 square meters, a small office, then a small bedroom, and then a bathroom.
He tries to beautify Longwood House. He brings personal mementos and furniture.
Why did the English choose Longwood? Because it's much easier to monitor. It was a farm on an isolated plateau that had become the summer residence of a governor.
Napoleon is forced to stay at Longwood House. He can also freely walk in the gardens, but the surveillance is everywhere around him. And if he wants to go horseback riding, if he wants to take a walk, he must be escorted by the English. The surveillance is not necessarily very discreet. The English soldiers approaches the house at night, trying to gather as much information as possible about what might be happening inside Longwood, which is why Napoleon always closes the shutters.
A small opening was made in one of the shutters, and there with his telescope, his spyglass, he looks at what's happening on the other side. It amuses him a lot, it distracts him. The British are so desperate not to see the Emperor that some go hide in the garden bushes, hoping to catch him by surprise. So it's really a sort of hide-and-seek game.
Upon arriving at Longwood, Napoleon still considers himself emperor, and so he wants to oppose the captivity rules imposed by the English with his own rules.
Even Longwood, this small house, becomes an imperial palace, with etiquette and an extremely strict protocol, because he says, "I am only emperor because of this."
You cannot enter or leave a room without the Emperor's permission. You cannot speak to him. He must speak to you first. He demands what is always called majesty.
He tolerates no deviations from etiquette, and when a distinguished visitor is announced, it is Napoleon himself who inspects the clothes, the shoes, and so on, to ensure he does not appear as an abandoned emperor, in other words, as someone who has become miserable.
All of Longwood will continue to treat him as if he was still on the throne, while the English, on the contrary, see only General Bonaparte, who is seized by delusions of grandeur and who takes himself for the emperor he's not.
Despite its isolation, the small island is a stopover between India and England. Hardly disembarked, the English travelers have only one obsession: meeting Napoleon.
Napoleon receives many people. He has received around approximately 500 people. For a prisoner, that is still considerable. Napoleon can receive ship captains, lieutenants, people who are not necessarily notable.
There are English ladies, wives of government members, British officers who request to visit the man who shook Europe.
First, they wait in the billiard room until they are received. Then, they are received in the lounge for people of, let's say, lesser importance. And those who are more important are received in the dining room.
To impress his visitors, Napoleon does not hesitate to display a splendor worthy of his status as emperor, of which the Louvre Museum preserves the testimony.
So, here we are in front of Napoleon I's coffee service, often called the Egyptian set, which was made at the Sèvres factory under the First Empire in the years 1808, 1810, and was delivered for the emperor's table at the Tuileries. This service is quite exceptional. The landscapes are executed on the cups and shaped pieces. The cups have litron shapes, meaning they have an extremely simple cylindrical form, and they are adorned with hieroglyphs on this dark blue background that really highlights them, with very high-quality gold, which was one of the specialties of the Sèvres factory. The saucers are further adorned with portraits executed with great finesse, a great sensitivity of these Egyptian leaders by a painter of the manufactory, Antoine Béranger. This was a set that Napoleon, as we know, was very attached to. It was not really a set that was used, but rather one he showed off at St. Helena to his visitors, and he even occasionally gave some pieces to visitors.
He plans to make allies of them, meaning he asks a lot of questions. He intends to charm. He knows that all these people, once back in England or Europe, will speak of him in good terms and thus influence other people.
Unfortunately for Napoleon, the ships stopping over bring more than just charming English ladies to the house.
You have to fight against an invader who is worse, I would almost say, in the eyes of the emperor than the Prussians or the British, and that is the rats. And the House of Longwood is literally infested with rats, and they fight them with bootjacks and fire pokers.
They had to put wire mesh around the libraries so they wouldn't devour Napoleon's books, because reading is still his favorite pastime.
Once Napoleon wanted to take his hat from a hook, and a rat was inside.
It is really a permanent and recurring problem because initially rat poison is used to try to eliminate these small creatures. However, the rats die in the walls, which emits pestilential smell. They end up resorting to traps that the Chinese servants set up, install, and themselves enjoy the rats, since obviously they cook them for themselves.
Each evening, the emperor's court is invited to dine in the Longwood dining room. Everyone must be in court attire, meaning court dress for the ladies, full dress for the gentlemen, with quite warm temperatures and a high level of humidity.
He has part of his service in solid gold, and in the dining room of Longwood, they set up a table to host a grand gala dinner.
In principle, each guest has a valet to attend to them. Since there aren't enough French staff, we will even employ English soldiers to serve at the table of General Bonaparte, who, in this case, has become Emperor Napoleon again.
Pierrot is the emperor's cook. He has set up a vegetable garden in the gardens, but everyone complains, both women and men, at the imperial table about the everyday fare, which is extremely bad.
The table at Longwood is not always as lavish as a French table of the time, but it is still quite enviable. There are meats, soups, appetizers, side dishes, desserts. The cook Pierrot is a fantastic pastry chef.
And Napoleon notably has banana fritters flamed with rum, which he did not necessarily have when he was at the Tuileries.
Napoleon was quite accustomed to eating very quickly and often with his fingers, and at dinner it was a nightmare for the ladies who were present, especially seeing him wipe his hands on his breeches.
The wine served at the table at Longwood for the emperor is first the wine of Constance, which is a wine from South Africa, brought by a ship from the Cape. It is indeed the easiest supply. Wines from France will be sent, but only a few in the end, because many French wines do not withstand the journey well, 2 to 3 months at sea. So a few Bordeaux would make it, but not Chambertin, for example, Napoleon's favorite wine.
As the French are bored and are under pressure and undoubtedly quite unhappy to be so far from home in Napoleon's entourage, whether officers or servants, there is a lot of drinking, and the alcohol bills which were quite shocking. So, several hundred bottles of whiskey consumed at Longwood every month, which is quite frightening. Napoleon drinks very little. He generally drinks a very small glass of wine mixed with water for his meal, and sometimes, exceptionally, a little champagne to go with dessert. But he is a very sober person.
Napoleon refuses to be a prisoner of war, refuses to be a prisoner, so all his policies are aimed at denying this fact.
He is not a resigned man, but on the contrary considers that he still has some cards to play, not to return to the top of affairs, but so that his fate is that of a captive who is better respected than he is at St. Helena.
Napoleon wants to write his memoirs because Caesar did it, and Napoleon intends to recall his exploits.
To write his memoirs, Napoleon set up a real battle plan, ultimately distributing roles to everyone around him. First to Las Casas, who is indeed somewhat his favorite, his darling, with his son, because Las Casas works with his son.
Las Casas is a man of letters, very refined, very cultured, and it is precisely a world quite different from the one in which Napoleon usually operates, which is a military world.
Napoleon sometimes summons Gourgaud, sometimes Montholon, and settles in. And Napoleon recounts these battles. He does not recount them from memory. He has documentation that he had sent over.
He remains standing, he walks, he dictates with passion. Napoleon insists on being very precise, as usual leaving nothing to chance. And his secretaries, his officers, quickly transcribe what they call these fabulous dictations. Napoleon is capable, as we know, of stimulating his mind and being truly prodigious.
Napoleon never writes out of vanity, perhaps because his handwriting is illegible, very difficult to read because he makes mistakes.
He mixes up words a bit. For example, he says rife annuity rent instead of life annuity rent. Little things like that. He always thought that the movement of the pen, the movement of the handwriting, slowed down his thinking. And he says it in a very beautiful letter. He says, "My thought goes faster than my hand." Napoleon had the ability to keep his mind very focused for hours, and the dictation continued as long as the emperor himself did not wish to stop. These secretaries sometimes ended up truly, physically, and mentally exhausted after several hours of dictation.
To explain this situation, he says, "Work is the scythe of time. Work helps avoid idleness, avoid boredom, and ultimately avoid depression."
From dictation to dictation, from battle to battle, Napoleon recounted himself, starting with his youth. He quickly accumulated thousands of pages, some of which are now preserved at the National Library.
Here is one of the manuscripts dictated by Napoleon at St. Helena, which is the manuscript of his memoirs on the Egyptian campaign. So here, at the moment of the battle, it's the Battle of the Pyramids. Napoleon had said to the soldiers, "Here are the pyramids. 40 centuries look down upon us." So this is the first version of one of Napoleon's most famous quotes. We have the writings of various people close to Napoleon side by side. Here we have the handwriting of Grand Marshal Bertrand. Here we have the handwriting of Lascas's son, and here we have the handwriting of Napoleon himself, which overlaps with the others, meaning these are the corrections he makes to his own dictation. For example, here a project of war against England, particularly illegible. You really need to be trained to read it. Here we have a sheet corrected by Napoleon, and he doodles this drawing. We can see that there are stylized ends that are repeated. There are these concentric shapes that somewhat resemble fortifications. It's a drawing unique to him, found on documents throughout the empire. Whenever he gets bored, he makes this type of drawing.
The four people surrounding Napoleon, Lascasses, Bertrand, Montholon, and Gourgaud, with wives, sons, and others, live together. And indeed, the close contact leads to frictions of pride.
We are in a suffocating closed environment where everyone is jealous, spies on each other, watches each other, observes each other. They are watching for the master's favor. The master can call you at any hour, so the one who is most favored will obviously be envied by the others. Gourgaud is very aggressive with Las Casas. He calls him the Jesuit. He constantly mocks him, his shyness, his fear. He even calls him a coward.
Las Casas is the outsider. the civilian, the one who comes poking his nose where he shouldn't.
General Gourgaud is devoted to Napoleon beyond what one can imagine. He believes that Napoleon has saved his life several times during his campaigns and that consequently, the emperor owes him something. And that something is affection. He is the very type of the lovelorn.
Napoleon hates when people are too familiar with him, even if he is affectionate. He wants to keep some distance and remain emperor. However, Gourgaud is becoming more and more familiar.
Never did anyone speak to Napoleon as Gourgaud speaks to him at St. Helena.
Gourgaud's feelings are too strong and unreasonable. They often clash. Their respective tempers are very strong, tempestuous, etc. Gourgaud starts crying. Napoleon gently tugs his ear, comforts him, etc. Every time, it starts over.
And Napoleon even said something very crude about Gourgaud. I thought he was going to bugger me. Yeah, he said that. So we can see that it's a small world. It's within a very limited area.
Obviously, it's the slightly cutting, somewhat military humor of Napoleon. Gourgaud is not homosexual, but he has this adoration for Napoleon.
Gourgaud seems to have completely lost his mind with jealousy. The consequence of this is that Gourgaud will be unbearable to everyone.
There was extremely serious disputes between Gourgaud and Montholon, and between Gourgaud and Las Cases. And in reality, each time Napoleon had to forbid them from arguing, forbid them from duelling. He punished them, notably by banning them from appearing in the salon and in the Longwood dining room.
Napoleon himself said, "I am great for great things, and small for small things." That's what's happening at St. Helena. That is to say, there is both the grandeur of this exile, the martyrdom, the sacrifice, and then there are the smallnesses, all these pettinesses towards his entourage.
And there are also the women. The women who try, in a way, to distract him. Great, deep, and total rivalry between General Bertrand's wife and General Montholon's wife. These women hate each other.
Napoleon would have liked to make Madame Bertrand one of his mistresses, but Madame Bertrand's fortress did not yield to the emperor's persistent siege.
On the other hand, Albine de Montholon was very lenient, with the complicity of Montholon himself, her husband.
So, for him, the fact that his wife becomes the emperor's mistress is almost an honor, as it was considered under the old regime.
Moreover, he will be well rewarded by receiving 2 million francs from the will. Montholon is the main beneficiary of Napoleon's will.
Albine de Montholon is a very beautiful woman, with a lot of manners. She is an ornament for Napoleon's world. He is happy to have her by his side. He is happy to enjoy her conversation. He is happy to enjoy her company.
The two courted each other and fell under each other's charm. But for Napoleon, who is seeking a bit of affection, a bit of comfort, and feminine presence, if I may say, he only has her. It's clear he seeks any affection, and he finds a little with Albine, but only a little.
And in fact, eventually, Albine de Montholon will find herself pregnant with a daughter who will be named Napoleone.
In the proximity of Longwood, Napoleon does not hesitate to divide and conquer, to better control those around him. That is why his true favorite is not who one might think.
Dinner at Longwood is organized by the butler, Cipriani, who is quite an intriguing Corsican.
With Cipriani, Napoleon has a familiarity he does not have with the others, because they can both speak in Italian or in Corsican dialect. They can exchange jokes or talk about their homeland. So, there is a kind of bond that forms between them. Napoleon finally finds someone who does not speak to him as a sovereign, but speaks to him more like a friend.
His position as a butler is more of a cover, even though he really performs his service. He is an agent of Napoleon, an agent of influence. This is particularly interesting, because as a butler, it is Cipriani who goes to the market to replenish supplies at Longwood. This gives him the freedom of movement on the island, allowing him to approach visitors and establish contacts.
He tries to gather information, rumours for the Emperor, and even simply gossip about what's happening, what the soldiers are doing, who's sleeping with whom, who's sick, who's healthy. So actually Cipriani is a sort of master spy. Napoleon is bored, so anything Cipriani can report to him as an anecdote from outside, he is extremely happy to hear.
He is the first confidant, if only because of the ease with which the two men communicate.
They improvise some card games or whist games. But the card games are a bit peculiar, since Napoleon, who hates losing, doesn't hesitate to cheat. Of course, no one dares to point it out to him.
And he cheats just for the pleasure of seeing the great Marshal Bertrand lose, since Bertrand is somewhat his scapegoat at times.
And we know, for example, that his most violent arguments with his mother were about cheating at cards. His mother had passed on her stinginess to him in his genes. The man, without being completely stingy, at least is thrifty and tight-fisted. He divided all the bills by 3, assuming beforehand that anyway, the suppliers were taking advantage of his goodwill and tripling the prices. So, it was normal for him to only pay 1/3 of the bills presented to him.
For the Emperor, the evenings at Longwood are also an opportunity to open up like never before, according to the conversation.
Hearing the Emperor recount the Battle of Jena, recount the Battle of Austerlitz, was a moment of ineffable and unforgettable grace.
And that's the contrast. When Napoleon tells his story in the evening at Longwood, the battle takes a different turn. It's full of life.
Napoleon often revisits the Battle of Waterloo. He questions the reasons for his defeat, a topic that remains intense because he lost the battle very recently.
He explains his defeat by the bad company, the ill will of his marshals, the mediocre quality of the troops. It becomes obsessive for him to accuse those who would have, in quotes, betrayed him. He accuses everyone except himself.
Lascazes, who wants to shine and especially wants to make Napoleon shine so he can take good notes, is the main organizer of the evenings. The other 3 listen, asking fewer questions than Lascazes does.
With Lascazes, Napoleon quickly understands that he can present a favorable image of himself and his history.
In his confidences more generally, Napoleon opens up a bit and reveals a more human side. There is a part of mea culpa, even if it is controlled, limited, but there is still some, especially with regard to slavery, where he acknowledges that the colonial expedition he sent to the Caribbean in 1802 was a profound mistake. They acknowledge some mistakes, not all. Napoleon opens up absolutely in a transparent and voluble manner.
Unlike the dull memoirs dictated in the afternoon, Napoleon's unfiltered remarks make for extraordinary material for a book.
The genius of Las Casas, of course, is to gather this wealth with great talent and to write it in an absolutely remarkable way.
The Memorial of St. Helena is a journal that is quite chronological day by day, and we see Napoleon living, taking a bath, courting Madame Bertrand.
This writing creates a very strong contrast between an exceptional life and a confinement that itself has rather dark and miserable aspects. These 2 styles alternate, which gives the memorial a wild originality.
Las Casas puts on paper what is the very movement of Napoleon's mind. Even if it's true that Las Casas then added a bit of his own touch, adding some memorable words, inventing a few anecdotes, and correcting some of the emperor's remarks he deemed inappropriate or poorly sounding. With Las Casas, we can find the movement of life, and it is this that is irreplaceable in his testimony.
At the end of the year 1816, Las Casas, having gathered the material necessary for his book, seized the first pretext to obtain his return to France. Napoleon lost his most valuable interlocutor. He soon abandons his dictations, which nevertheless allowed him to combat the melancholy of exile.
Hudson Lowe is an English military officer who has not had an extraordinary career so far. He is especially noted for having raised a regiment of Corsicans who fought against France.
Let's imagine a tall, rather gaunt man, extremely meticulous, seriously lacking in humor, which is quite terrible for a Briton. The day after his arrival, Hudson Lowe asks to see his prisoner, and it is 9 in the morning.
Quite simply, we know very well that if he gives the English even a tiny ease, then everything is permitted.
He arrives unannounced, allowing Napoleon to refuse to see him, and thus to say, "You see how rude this man is, the way he treats me."
The Grand Marshal of the palace informs him that His Majesty is not available, and that he must request an audience for another day.
Hudson Lowe is in a state of rage. It's a string of insults he somehow pours out on Napoleon. So, he champs at the bit for hours and hours and hours, waiting for his prisoner to agree to receive him.
The new governor takes up residence in the magnificent house reserved for him, Plantation House, 4 kilometers from Longwood. And it is only the next day, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, that Napoleon finally deigns to receive him.
Napoleon wants to pursue his advantage. So first, he imposes the language of the conversation, which is Italian.
The two opponents are watching each other. They circle each other, look for openings, throw a few barbs.
Napoleon, who hopes to improve his captivity conditions, takes the advantage in the conversation because, in fact, it's a soliloquy. Napoleon, it's a monologue, and even if he asks some questions, Hudson Lowe, a bit embarrassed, doesn't really respond. Hudson Lowe remains unmoved, stiff and straight in his boots. Napoleon immediately senses that his charm is not working. The man in front of him is a wall.
After this first meeting, Hudson Lowe immediately signs an initial regulation that toughens the detention conditions at Longwood.
Napoleon learns that he can no longer go out after a certain hour, that he is no longer able to take his carriage for a ride, that he isn't allowed to ride his horse or to meet certain people.
And immediately, this sours his relationship with the French. So right from the start, Hudson Lowe is seen in a very negative light.
Hudson Lowe was tremendously small-minded about the rules and regulations. When Napoleon had a chess set sent to him, which had the initials N on some of the pieces, Hudson Lowe would not give it to him because he said that the N representing Emperor Napoleon was not allowed because Napoleon was not an emperor, he was a general.
Inside the island, Napoleon is guarded in a concentric manner. There are first checkpoints with guards, sentinels scattered everywhere. Let's add that there is a system of flags installed on the island. There are 17 to 18 points, each with a specific meaning. Bonaparte escaped, Napoleon has escaped, Napoleon is sick, Napoleon is walking. So every time there is a change in Napoleon's situation, a flag is hoisted during the day, and it is relayed throughout the island, ensuring everyone knows what Napoleon is doing. Never has so many resources been used to guard a single man. Because beyond the island of St. Helena itself, it's an entire ocean, the South Atlantic, dedicated to Napoleon. Then there's the entire fleet, the British South Atlantic Fleet, that regulates maritime traffic around St. Helena and prevents anyone from approaching.
Even though the island of St. Helena is a natural defense, in Hudson Lowe's eyes, that's not enough. He constantly requests additional reinforcements from London.
3,000 garrison men are stationed. The only very narrow bays that allow entry into this volcanic rock are walled up. It's a sort of little Great Wall of China that has been built by the English, and on which they have installed nearly 500 cannons to defend the island. That's still twice as many cannons as at the Battle of Waterloo.
Napoleon has this saying, "A bird itself could not escape," and he has it told to Hudson Lowe, "But really, what are you afraid of? That I will transform into a bird?"
There were many escape plans devised by former generals of Napoleon in America, in Brazil, by adventurers, but more astonishingly, by the British who, hostile to their government, wanted to help Napoleon escape, to free him. The most far-fetched and inventive among them is an Englishman who built 2 submarines in the suburbs of London.
Napoleon was informed about several of these plans, and one of them at least took a concrete turn. It involved disguising him as a Chinese worker. He would have been hidden in a beer barrel that would be loaded onto a ship. After some reflection, Napoleon eventually concluded that after having been the master of Europe, he could not escape disguised as a Chinese worker in a beer barrel.
Napoleon is a methodical man. He is a man of system. He will systematically do everything to present himself as the martyr of England.
Napoleon's objective is very simple. By stripping me of the tyrant's cloak, Hudson Lowe turns me into a martyr.
And in this game, Hudson Lowe is far too foolish to understand where Napoleon wants to lead him.
It is Napoleon who continuously provokes him. Hudson Lowe's only military achievement was holding Capri, and he was driven out by the French. He made a pitiful retreat, and every time Napoleon sees him, he reminds him of this defeat. This offends Hudson Lowe, who indeed becomes increasingly hostile to Napoleon.
Napoleon complains about being treated too harshly.
We've seen sentinels aim at the emperor, not to show their zeal, but simply to obey Hudson Lowe's latest directives.
So on one side, you have someone who is seeking provocations, and on the other, someone who, by foolishness, gets caught up in Napoleon's game and doesn't realize it.
He became more and more paranoid because Napoleon drove him crazy. Napoleon did everything to make Hudson Lowe become rigid.
And he engages in a kind of perpetual zeal that gives Napoleon plenty of fodder.
Hudson Lowe ended up becoming this completely intransigent, extremely unpleasant, icy jailer that Napoleon wanted him to be.
The meshes of the English net are more than pierced. Hudson Lowe's surveillance system is completely circumvented by Napoleon. Many ships stop at St. Helena. Dozens of ships stop there each month. They are English, of course. So Napoleon's servants can approach these ship captains, these sailors, these mariners, and offer them very large sums, usually between 10 and 15,000 francs. A package is handed to you. It is brought back to England. This means that Napoleon writes, publishes, sends messages to England as he wishes. It is estimated that he spent 1 million francs on this, which is enormous, giving us about 70 to 80 secret messages, probably sent to England for the most part.
Napoleon's life in St. Helena is covered in minute detail by the British press, I think. All the letters that are slipping home from one person or another tend to be reaching the press, and all the details are there. The moment that he's no longer dangerous, he becomes almost a sympathetic figure. And certainly people are very interested in what's happening to him. The way that an enemy disarmed becomes sympathetic is exactly what the British government was scared of.
I think that there's a true love-hate relationship that the British had with Napoleon. They loved his ideas, many of them. People, especially on the radical side of politics, thought that Napoleon was doing things for France that they wanted done in Britain. So we are very schizophrenic about Napoleon. A great man, but a great enemy.
In London, one house is particularly representative of the ambiguity of English feelings, Apsley House. The residence of the Duke of Wellington, a direct descendant of the victor of Waterloo, the person who defeated Napoleon.
The statue was actually commissioned by Napoleon Bonaparte from Canova, the well-known Italian sculptor. I suspect, as the Emperor of the French, he didn't expect to be sculpted in the nude. And I think he wasn't happy when the sculpture arrived in Paris. And apparently he didn't allow anybody to see it, and it was left in its box in the basement of the Louvre. The British government decided to acquire it, to buy it from the French government, and give it as a present to Wellington. Whether Wellington was pleased to receive the gift, we don't know.
At Apsley House, the Waterloo Gallery houses an extraordinary collection of paintings given by the King of Spain to thank Wellington for liberating him from the French. And in the dining room, a sumptuous table runner is overlooked by portraits of Allied sovereigns, victors over Napoleon.
There are a number of images of Napoleon and his members of his family. This was painted just after he became emperor, and that is the Empress Josephine. There's a painting along here of Napoleon as a younger man when he was still consul. The first Duke of Wellington had a greater